I'm so excited that you took the time to join us on the next episode of Beyond the Culture. This is the show where we embrace change and challenge cultural norms and ideals. I'm your host, Dr. David Walker. Please let me give you your official introduction.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Today on the show, Beyond the Culture, I have Mr. Bijan Bayne. Bijan is an award-winning Washington-based freelance columnist and critic, and the leading literary historian on United States race relations. He is the author of several books, including Sky Kings, Black Pioneers of Professional Basketball, which was named to the suggested reading list of the Basketball Hall of Fame in 2004. He is also the author of the best-selling book, Elgin Baylor, The Man Who Changed Basketball. He is a producer, writer, and he recently did a docuseries, 6 Degrees of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He's a public policy fellow and editor. He works with the World Bank Group, the New York Times, ESPN, and the Washington Post. And I am super excited today to have on our show, Beyond the Culture, Mr. Bijan Bayne. Bijan, how you doing today?
I'm great, Dr. Walker. Thanks for having me on.
Yes. And I'm glad you're on. And I really want to get into this conversation today because I know you're a sports guy. You love sports. You're a sports writer. And we're going to talk about a few things, especially all things Washington, D.C.
Or all things community, yes.
Yeah. And ironically, I just spent a few days in Washington, D.C., went down and saw the African-American Museum and all kinds of things and just got back. So this is, I guess it's a coincidence that you're on today.
Yes.
So you're into sports writing. And I want to ask this question. I want to start here. How did you get into sports writing? Was it a lifelong dream or did you just happen to fall into it?
A love of reading about it when I was a little child. When I was 9, I transferred to a school that was all male. It was a prep school. And I was illiterate in that realm because I hadn't really followed it in other schools, 3rd grade, 4th grade, what have you. So when I transferred, because they were all boys, it would come up a lot. And it was part of social inclusion, like baseball cards or batting average. And I had been to other schools where all the little kids had baseball cards too, but they were both genders. So the pressure to be literate wasn't quite as high, because it was both genders. But when there was all one gender, and not all the little boys followed sports, but a lot of them did. And it was Washington, and Vince Lombardi was coming to town to coach, and Ted Williams was coming to town to manage, and the ABA Washington Caps were coming to town. They were brand new, and Lefty Driesell was coming to town to coach basketball. This was all the same year that I enrolled in that school. So I was like, I better get up. So it's amazing how human beings have the capacity to adapt. They can live on the North Pole, and they can live in Brazil. They can live in the Sahara. They can live in the Savannah. They can live in skyscrapers, and they can live in, huts, I guess, just depending. But we're all one species. So I was the same child, literally. But you have to sort of fit in. And so I started reading books about it a little bit, because there were a lot of books in the school library and books at the bookmobile and books at the public library, closest public library. Because you couldn't download anything or look up anything because that wasn't that era. And I didn't ask my folks. And there was some stuff around the house, like encyclopedias and things like that, would have little chapters or sections on one sport. Just, like a literal definition of a sport, like soccer. It would be like an overview. So I started getting up to speed, and I was interested in it for some reason. One, because that school had teams that played other prep schools. Not when you're 9, but when you're about 12, 13, 14, 15. So that was new, because they hadn't done that where I was before. And I started liking it. I started liking sort of the history element of it, of people that had played before my time. And because of that love of it, I started kind of playing around with writing little stuff of my own. Like I'd make up fake athletes or fake leagues or fake cities and teams or fake high school basketball teams, because of the kind of stuff I was reading about in the real world, like in Boys Life and Sports Illustrated and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So as I grew up, I couldn't play well anymore, after 17 or 18. So the only way to stay in touch with it and sort of fulfill that love was to write about it. That's the closest thing I could think of, because I'm a communicator, is to keep in touch with that universe, was to tell other people about it or research it or report about
Awesome. And obviously, it's been a love for you throughout your journey. And it's always interesting how people get started with, what they do for a career, and especially being an athlete, and then you discover that you're not going to make it to the pros. So you got to do something else to stay connected.
I'm still a little upset about that one. I still kind of feel a way about it. I would have rather been the person, in the finals of the 100 meters, than the person telling somebody about Bob Hayes or Rod Milburn or Allison Felix. But that's okay. I'll take it.
Absolutely. So listen, as I mentioned at the start and in the introduction, you are the Washington, D.C. community is where you live and where you primarily do your work. And the other day, I happened to come across it was a presentation, and you were with I think it was a Mayor Sharon Pratt.
Yes.
And another gentleman, Brad Snyder.
Brad Snyder, yeah, my brother, yeah.
Yeah, and you guys were doing a YouTube presentation. It was titled "Washington D.C. City of Champions."
Oh, you were able to see that?
Yeah, yeah.
You're the one.
Okay, yeah, I'm the one that watched it, and it was very enlightening. I'm a New Yorker, but hearing you talk about all the different championships that were in DC, you even went back to the 12th Street Y of 1910. I mean, yeah, wow,
we had to take it there.
Yeah, but that was very intriguing, and of course, other championships in Washington, the 1924 Washington Senators, the Washington Bullets of the 70s, and the Washington football team. So there's a lot of champions in DC, but it seems like that for some reason there's an oversight to the greatness of DC. So I don't know whether that presentation had to do with some of it, but
a little bit.
Yeah, but when you were naming names, I mean, Vince Lombardi connected to DC, John Thompson, Kevin Durant, all these names that I knew, but it just sounded like some people seem to overlook the greatness.
Yeah, nationally, they're not connected to the city.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
That happens with a lot of cities. A lot of times what happens is, if you don't follow something really closely, like music or sports or hip hop or fashion, you don't think of a celebrity as connected to their hometown. Like, people know Beyonce's from Houston.
Okay.
Generally.
Right.
People generally know so-and-so's from Chicago, like Jennifer Hudson or Isaiah Thomas. A lot of people know that, or Dwayne Wade, but they don't know everybody from Chicago, everybody from Detroit, everybody from New Orleans, everybody from the Bronx. They know if the person mentions it a lot, or if they rep it a lot, or if it comes up in their lyrics or their fashion or something they do. If the person doesn't emphasize it a lot after they become successful, like they don't have songs where they say H-Town or the Lou, like Nelly says the Lou, then you don't know everybody from St. Louis.
Right.
So I think that happens with things like sport and music and politics. You don't necessarily know like every politician who's from the Bay Area. People might know, the Kamala's from the Bay Area because it comes up, and because she was recently in state politics.
Right.
People probably think Pelosi's from the Bay Area, but she's not. She's from Baltimore because her father was mayor of Baltimore. But she's been associated with the Bay Area so long that most people probably think she was born in the Bay Area, because there's a lot of Italians in San Francisco. So they wouldn't be too far off. She just doesn't happen to be from there. She moved there. So I think that's what happens, when a guy like Durant moves on to what he does for a living, or a better example might be Marvin Gaye or Duke Ellington. Some people associate them with Washington, like the old heads, because they grew up hearing about them from their grandmothers or their grandpa. But the national audience doesn't necessarily know where that person's from, unless it comes up a lot every time the person's name is mentioned or referenced, or they mention it a lot, like a hip hop artist would do. Because hip hop artists are always like repping their hometown and shouting out, the biggies of the world. You kind of know, like, everybody knows where Pac's from, because Pac's from Baltimore. Everybody, and a lot of people even know a lot about Pac because he moved to the Bay Area with the whole digital, so they know that because they follow his career closely. but they don't know to everybody from Baltimore.
Right, right. Yeah, and you had I mean you listed names, and then not so much as that all these people are from Baltimore. Some are, but there's still a great connection because, as I said, you know, like in the NBA now, you got Victor Oladipo, you got Kevin Durant in the NBA now. We know historical coaches John Thompson, Red Auerbach, Sugar Ray Leonard is from the DC area.
Mm-hmm.
Then you mentioned how Vince Lombardi came back and was connected in some ways to
Sure,
DC. Ted Williams, George
sure.
Allen. So there's a lot of legacy and greatness in the DC area, and I would have to agree that it is a sense of oversight because it's not a big city, but the sports and the talent has been legendary. And
Well,
it's a
here's
shame.
part of it too. If the city is associated primarily with something else. So
Okay.
if the city is primarily associated with something else, like being the seat of government, that's going to override all other things that it's known for, especially globally and even nationally to some extent. On the Eastern Seaboard, people might know that it's produced a lot of basketball players because they kind of grew up reading about it, interacted with them, or their teams played against them, or they read about it in their papers like New York, Jersey, Philly. They know about it, same recruiting classes and things like that. But when you get away from the Eastern Seaboard, it might not be as well known because the city has something else that it's better known for, and that supersedes everything because it's politics, government, uh, federal bureaus, and things like that. That overrides any sports reputation that's going to have. Especially to your point, of a lot of those people came there as adults.
Right,
George
right,
Allen didn't come there until he was accomplished somewhere else. Vince
right.
Lombardi didn't come there until he's accomplished somewhere else. Thompson just happens to be a native.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, Speaking of basketball, you wrote several books, but there's one I want to talk about, and primarily because of the title. So you know where I'm
I
going, right?
love. Well, that could be one of two books. So
Well,
I'm curious.
well, Elgin Baylor, the man who changed basketball, and the reason why it's for someone who's in sports, maybe it may not necessarily be striking, but I do want to address it because most people, when you talk about changing the game, of course, they're going to say a Michael Jordan. They even made LeBron in some ways, and here the Big Dipper, Wilt Chamberlain, because how rules would change.
Mm-hmm.
But you say your book is about Elgin Baylor, and you claim that he's the man who changed basketball. Why do you make that claim in your book that he changed basketball?
Well, actually, it's a claim made by others beyond me, of course, and I didn't initiate it. But the claim doesn't speak so much to rules or popularity or global involvement in the sport. It speaks to the style of play that we take for granted nowadays. The
Okay.
way that Dwayne Wade plays, and that Michael Jordan plays, and that Julius Erving plays, and that Connie Hawkins plays. The first person anybody saw on a national scale play that way, like changing hands in midair, bringing the ball down and bringing it back up, double clutching in midair, adjusting his body in midair in response to what the defender is presenting. It's not that nobody did it before him. People probably did it on the schoolyards and things like that. But the first person most people say they saw do it on when they turned on their TV set, no matter where they lived, was him. So
Okay.
the people that tended to do it more in his aftermath or in his wake are, people like Connie Hawkins and Julius Erving because they got some ideas from him. So that's one reason why I say he changed the game. The other reason is because the game moved to Southern California because of him. So
Okay.
there would be no team in Hollywood if it hadn't been for his owner's initiative that he was getting a little bit too big for the Minneapolis market.
Mm-hmm.
So that changed the sport because it gave them a team in California, a pro team in California. And that changed everything. That changed how UCLA could recruit because the kids were getting better that lived right in that region. And they actually won a national title before they had Alcindor. So it attracted Alcindor because they'd already won 2 crowns before he got there in 64 and 65, because the kids were more interested in it because they grew up watching Baylor and they got
Okay.
better. And that made the sport more of a thing in that region. It became more of a hotbed.
Okay.
And that's a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of people in greater Los Angeles and the surrounding counties. So now that it was a hot thing to do, and children were interested in it, they got better, and UCLA got better because UCLA wasn't that good before he got to the Lakers.
Okay.
Cal was the dominant team in the conference, and Cal had played in the national finals, I think, in 59 and maybe 60. So Pete Newell was the prominent basketball coach on the West Coast, not Wooden. Baylor gets there, now it's Wooden.
Right.
Because Wooden is able to get Alcindor because of these 2 titles that he's already won. Alcindor, travels 3,000 miles to play there. That doesn't happen. Alcindor probably goes to maybe like St. John's. So that's another reason why I say he changed the game. And also because of some of the social stances that he made from his rookie year on, like not playing in games when he was denied lodging because of segregation, he changed the way that the athletes conducted themselves and the way that they demanded to be treated in the game, including people like Bill Russell.
I'm glad you mentioned his social stance, because obviously that has been a major part of being an athlete, having a social stance. Obviously, everyone didn't, but he was one that did. Mm-hmm. As you well know, there's a legendary picture. It's known as the Cleveland Summit.
Yes.
Back in 1964, where it was Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and many other athletes. I won't go through all the names, but I know everyone would know those names. And those Black athletes stood up for social justice issues, as Elgin Baylor did, as you so eloquently said. My question is, what do you think about the athletes today standing up for social justice issues compared to the athletes of the 1960s?
Well, a lot of people, and I think I count myself in this number as well, feel like a lot of what happened in the 1960s was dictated by the times in combination with the character of the people who stood up. So it wasn't in some people's character to be that vocal about that. Maybe say Willie Mays. Not that Willie Mays never said anything about that. He did write, letters to Autherine Lucy, but she was the first Black student admitted to the university. Well, they tried to admit her to the University of Alabama. Letters of encouragement, and he did, make he did public address announcements or PSAs to keep people in San Francisco in their homes, as opposed to participating in what they called the Hunters Point riots. He was playing a game on the road, and he said, we're playing, I don't know, the Atlanta Braves on the road or the New York Mets on the road. We encourage you to stay in your homes and keep cool and watch the game, as opposed to violence or disorder. And he did some things behind the scenes as well, but he wasn't in front of the cameras and at summits like that. Neither was Henry Aaron, although Henry Aaron was very vocal, more like behind the scenes. He voiced his opinion about, lack of Black managers, I think in Sport Magazine around 64, 66. And he didn't want to move to Atlanta unless the Milwaukee Braves could ensure him that the transition was going to make sure that there wasn't a lot of vestiges of segregation and Jim Crow. When the team moved, players would be able to find places to live, and that they wouldn't be socially outcast like Baylor was in that situation in West Virginia. So I'm not saying Hank Aaron didn't do things. I don't want people to get the wrong impression here. But in terms of the people that were most identified with it, like the Jackie Robinsons, the Bill Russells, and the Jim Browns, part of it is a combination of their character, and part of it is dictated by the times. Not so much demanded it, but it was the number one, maybe other than Vietnam and going to the moon, it was the number one social issue of the day.
Okay.
So it didn't become the number one social issue or one of the top 3 or 4 social issues of the day again until the late 2010s. So that's why you might have more people being voicing their opinions about it, wearing T-shirts, walking out in unison before games with the same shirt on, like the WNBA often does, writing columns about it, Maya Moore discontinuing her career and things like that, because the stories are more in the national limelight than maybe they were 15 or 20 years ago. It's not to say these things weren't happening, But of course, with people capturing them on their smartphones, it's sort of, one, less deniable, and two, it garners more media attention when you have a video of
it. And here's a question. You know, I know that most Black athletes, when they do protest, you know, they feel that they have a right to do it. But sometimes the challenge becomes whether it should be on the field or off the field. Mm-hmm. What do you think about where they do it, and is that appropriate where they do it, like especially on the field?
That's a good question. I've never really been, well, I've had it come up in private conversation when the Kaepernick situation presented itself. And I was asked it on a couple of talk shows too. I shouldn't say that. I think it just, to paraphrase something somebody told me once, who was a national leader, and I wrote him a letter and asked him, what should I join a group, or should I follow this or follow that? And he said, follow the dictates of your conscience. He didn't say join my group, because I was only like 19 or 20 when I wrote him. People have to follow the dictates of their conscience. Obviously, every owner is different. Mm-hmm. Some owners suspend people, some don't. Some owners make threats, like if anybody does this, they're going to be blah, blah, blah. I think whether you do it in the workplace or not is a little different in sport than it is if you're a plumber or an accountant, because it has more coverage. Mm-hmm. And also because you are in a profession that is entertainment and you make more money than most accountants. So the risk reward is higher, but the blowback, because more people know who you are than a plumber, is going to be broader than it would be if you made that kind of stance on what we call a 9-to-5 job, where only 30 people know about it. So I can't say that it's right or wrong whether they do it in the ballpark, in the stadium, on the rink, on the ice, outside the stadium, on their blog, on their vlog, on their Players Tribune or not, because it depends. It's very case by case in terms of what is the incident that they're addressing, and who did it affect, and who do they feel they're voicing. Do they feel like they're representing the voiceless? Do they feel that it transcends into sport? Do they feel like they've also been pulled over because somebody didn't recognize them, or they feel like they're voicing the opinion of their less likely to have a platform brethren and sisters who don't have that outlet, so they're going to take advantage of the fact that they do have an outlet and they do have a large following. It's very, very case by case. Even back in the 60s with some of the ball players who weren't even as vocal as Aaron or Mays, because baseball players didn't tend to get in the national conversation about the civil rights movement the way Russell and Brown did. There's something about baseball that didn't lend itself to people talking about that too much. Even when Curt Flood was before the Supreme Court, none of the other ball players who were still active came and supported him.
Wow.
Not even Gibson.
And they only two team.
They want to, and Gibson's kind of vocal. He's considered sort of prideful and vocal.
Sure.
But nobody came. Most of them thought their owners would penalize them in some kind of way, I guess, because there was players didn't have a lot of rights. They didn't have free agency, so they could trade you.
Right.
That was the whole. That was the whole point of what he was doing, is that they could trade you. And some of them just, because they asked guys like, "Why didn't you go support him? Why didn't you just go one day and just sit there?" And they said, the owners, don't have that much. They didn't have that much leverage back then. That's one reason. The only two people that supported him, and I'll keep this short, were Hank Greenberg, who was retired, and Jackie Robinson, who was retired, because have as much skin in the game anymore.
Exactly.
But yeah, to your point, I don't think there's a right or wrong. I just think you have to weigh the impact on your family, hate mail, whatever, the blogosphere, the comment section, getting traded. They have leverage, but they still get traded. And then how upset you are. Baylor, these people, they were just very, rightfully so, upset. And a lot of people in positions of prominence feel like it almost behooves them more to come forward because they have a microphone. And the silent, the mothers and the families of the people that have unarmed people that have been shot. Of course, they gain one, unfortunately, when the person dies.
Right. Yeah.
But the mass majority of them don't have a forum. And so they feel like I have a forum. It's even more incumbent on me to say something. So I think that's where some people are coming from. If they want to do it at the ballpark or in the locker room when they're surrounded by media at the locker room, that's really on them, and it's kind of case by case. John Carlos and Tommy Smith were suspended from the Olympic Village. And there's some mandates. I mean, we don't even know whether there's going to be a Tokyo Games because only 2% of the people over there have been, I read the most recent thing, only 2% of the people have been vaccinated in Japan. But let's say there is one. There's some guidelines about protest there from the IOC.
Right.
And maybe even the US. I don't know if the USOC has any, but there's some guidelines about what will be tolerated. I'm not saying that they're oppressive or bad. I didn't read what they were, but I know that there are some.
You brought up the subject of baseball, and something else I found out about you is that you're fluent in Spanish.
Is that true? You really did a deep dive on the internet because I don't even know if that's out there.
It's out there. Well, here's why I bring the two up, baseball and Spanish, because a few years ago there was a dearth of Black African American athletes from the States playing baseball. And they were reaching over to Latin American countries, maybe Dominican Republic. But what do you think? Has it increased where more Black athletes are coming back? Because you mentioned Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson. Back in the day, you could just name Black, American athletes playing baseball. But today is such a dearth. Why is it, and what is baseball doing about it?
Well, in the 90s and the early 2000s, they formed these organizations like Return Baseball to the Inner Cities. I think the acronym is RBI. Some teams made efforts to build more sandlots and diamonds in cities, have more instruction and coaching, because instruction and coaching is one of the big dearths or voids that there isn't as much of as there were when Gibson and those guys were growing up. Youth leaders, volunteers, because you're really not getting paid. And some cities probably don't even have a little league system or the equivalent of a little league. So there's that. It's not something you can just go do, like shoot baskets. There has to sort of be you could do it on a sandlot. You don't need a diamond and bases, but you have to have a parking lot or something and enough children. And then you have to have some kind of equipment that assimilates a real game. It's not like just a basketball.
Right.
So there has to be sort of some infrastructure, almost like hockey. You have to have some infrastructure, nets, pucks, sticks. You can do it on skates, and people do it in the inner city. You do it on blades and on skates, and they have just a net. But it's to get good and to get the proper training, you have to have some of the elements or the tools or the utensils of the real thing. And if there's not enough adults teaching it, or they played it in high school, because basketball and football became more popular or superseded it in terms of, well, first of all, it's a summer thing. It's a summer sport. So the kids are out of school by the time it really gets up and ramped up. So if you're in Brooklyn or Manhattan or Miami, well, Miami's different because there's so many Caribbean and Latin America. But if you're in some of these big cities, by the time the season really gets started, it's like, oops, school's out.
There you go.
So there's nobody in the stand. Nobody comes to watch it. It's not, guys are, young ladies don't come watch this sport. So I'm going to play the ones that the young ladies go watch. There's a lot of factors, but I think that, piggybacking on your thing about the Aarons and the Mazes, if there's less Aarons and Mazes in the focus, nationally, those aren't going to be the people that you're going to try to model. You're going to try to model, LeBron James and Allen Iverson and Kobe and Steph Curry, because they're the ones that are always on Sports Center,
right?
Always on the internet, always on Instagram. There's less Dwight Goodens and less Strawberries and less Reggies and less Barry Bondses and less, fewer Vida blues than there were. Not to say that there's none. It's maybe 7% compared to 27 or 30%.
Right.
So then people did scout the Caribbean more, understandably so. And so I think a lot of it is just if there's no adult to push it, and there's no media figures who you want to grow up and be like, so that's why you're doing it, like we did when we were small. Those two factors of they're not the people that are getting the most attention. Even Mahomes, who father played baseball, he can play baseball. Russell Wilson's a good baseball player. Jameis Winston's a good baseball player, but they all play football.
Right.
They play some baseball, like some minor league in between and like that. But for the most part, they're considered football players. So even people that do both play. Dion played both. Bo played both, but they're football. In college, they got more
notoriety. I guess
notoriety for being on the football team.
Sure.
Frank Thomas was a tight end.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's a tight end, but he's a baseball player.
Sure,
You can do it longer.
Right.
Some guys do it. Some guys opt to do it. It's a harder sport.
Sure.
You strike. If you bat 300, that's considered excellent.
That's exactly.
If Russell Wilson's completion percentage was 30%, he'd be out of a job. So it's a harder sport. You have to play in the minors. Most people do. Not everybody has to play in the minors. Some people go straight.
Sure.
But for a Black person, I guess under 30, the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, there's no Griffey Jr. anymore. There's no Quinn. There's no Puckett.
That's right.
There's been a LeBron the last 15 or 20 years.
Basketball.
Yeah.
yeah.
There's been a Durant the last 5 to 8. A Harden. A Kyrie. So children, path of least resistance. And I'm not even saying Black people should even want to do any of these things for a living. Right. As opposed to being an accountant or a CEO or a nurse practitioner or an attorney, because you're not going to make it. The numbers dictate that you're not going to, the chances of you making it are sort of slim. So even being so aspirational to that is sort of misplaced anyway. But it was misplaced when Mays was playing, but a lot of people wanted to do it. And even for fun, a lot of people wanted to go out and do it because they want to be like Willie Mays. They wanted, just like, Connie Hawkins and Julius Erving wanted to do these amazing things in midair like Baylor. Well, kids want to go out and make some kind of, what we call a circus catch, like Willie Mays.
Sure. And with the hat falling off, right?
Yeah, it's something exciting. Children like superhero-looking stuff, like Michael Vick. That's superhero. He looks like he's in a video game.
Exactly.
Or Mahomes or Lamar. They look like they're doing things that are unreal. There's more people that youth see doing that in a basketball context or a football context right now than they do see in a baseball context right now, especially Black Americans.
Absolutely.
Steph is making this 40-foot shot, and now everybody,
then you want to go back there and shoot it, right?
Coach can't get kids to look. You shoot from your range.
Exactly. Let me ask you this question: all the people that you've either interviewed or written about, who would you say for you was the most rewarding?
Oh, wow. Most rewarding would probably be something that hasn't dropped yet. It would probably be the upcoming docuseries about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, although it hasn't been rewarding yet.
Okay.
But it's rewarding to me because I already know how it's going to resonate with people because I know the topics we're going to cover.
Wow.
Because it's beyond basketball.
Okay.
So I would say it's the most rewarding in anticipation, or most rewarding, like you say, thank you in advance. In that way. Most rewarding in retrospect, I would say the people would probably be the ball players I interviewed from Puerto Rico and countries in the Caribbean when I was working on writing about baseball history in Latin America. My, most of the players I interviewed were what we would call Afro-Latin players or Afro-Caribbean players, because they were so kind to me and so generous and so open and forthcoming, and some of them introduced me to one another, which opened a lot of doors. They treated me almost like a nephew. So I would say that was rewarding in the sense of the relationships that were formed, because those guys were so accessible. They weren't like former superstars in the US. Their phone numbers were in the phone book in Puerto Rico, like there's nothing. this was pre-internet, and they were very generous with their time. And even in one instance, one of the former players, they call him Victor Peyo in Puerto Rico, but Americans call him Big Power. I had a rent a car, and so he and his son had played in like a American Legion All-Star game earlier that day. His son was about 17. So I had attended the American Legion All-Star game because there were going to be a lot of scouts there who had played in the big leagues, and I was hoping to interview some of those people later on. Not that day because they were busy scouting and timing people and taking notes about, this person's, fielding or batting or running or throwing ability. So I wasn't bothering them that day. But Vic Power was kind enough to introduce me along when there was like a moment that seemed appropriate. He would walk me over and say, "This is Camilo Pascual, or this is Ruben Amaro, or this is Luis Arroyo," and all these guys. I knew who they were famous.
Sure.
So later that day, I followed him to his home, and I sort of interviewed him on his front porch for about 4.5 hours. When it got dark, and this is like probably like April, May, so it gets dark pretty late,
Sure.
So when it got dark, I had to drive back to the part of Puerto Rico where I was staying, to my hotel or guest house. So I only knew the way from the main roads, like the main highways, and from San Juan and from the airport and from Isla Verde, the places you would go between getting to where I stayed and maybe like San Juan or some of the big cities. He lived in Guaynabo, so I didn't know the way. I didn't have like MapQuest and all that kind of stuff. This was like early 90s. So I didn't know the way literally from his door to my hotel.
Okay.
So he got in the car with his 17-year-old son. I don't know why he made his boy do this, but I followed them until we got to the main highway, and then they turned back. So that because he knew I knew the rest of the way from there.
Gotcha.
You didn't have to do that. We've been sitting there like 4.5 hours, and we almost been together most of the day. You didn't have to do that. So I think that's the most rewarding because I got to meet him and Juan Pizarro and Nino Escalera, who used to be the director of scouting in Latin America for the Giants and for the Mets and had played for the Reds for a little while. He's considered either the first Black Cincinnati Red or he's tied with Chuck Harmon because they debuted on the same day. So I think they both debuted maybe the same day or the same week. So either he or Chuck Harmon is the first Black person to play for the Cincinnati Reds. His name is Saturnino Escalera, but they call him Nino Escalera or Flo Escalera. His name is Flo. So yeah, those guys were they just adopted me.
Wonderful.
Nino Escalera said, "Oh, you're like a nephew to me," because the first year I went, I didn't stay in a hotel. I didn't know that many ball players' names to look up. I didn't find that many people. There was no internet. So the first year I went, I stayed with an aunt by marriage. And second year I stayed in a hotel. So the aunt had gone to high school with Nino Escalera. And I told him that. So the second or third year I went, I said, "Oh, my aunt is blah, blah, blah." Because she had told me she knew him. She said, "Oh, I know Flo." So I said, "My aunt is Aida." I told him her maiden name. I said, "My aunt was Aida Quinones." He said, "Oh, I know her." She said, "Basically, you're like a nephew to me. Let me know if you need anything." And I interviewed him at his home. So that was the most rewarding just because of the warmth, not because of the literature that resulted from it or the facts I learned or the ballparks I went to, but just the warmth that I received, not just from them, but from fans over there and historians over there who learned that I was working on that. They were so welcoming. They're like, "You're American? You learned Spanish because of this?" And
there you go.
And they wanted to talk about Josh Gibson playing there and this person playing there and Satchel. And I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about their heroes.
Sure. And let me ask you this, and this is going to be my final question. Who would be the one person that you would want to interview in history? Maybe sports or otherwise, but the one person that you would want, that you obviously you didn't, but if you had the opportunity to sit before them and interview them or write a piece on them, who is that one person that you would say, that's the person that I have to, interview or write about before I leave this world? If you had that chance, anyone in history.
Okay, it's kind of a toss up. It would either be Ella Baker or James Baldwin or maybe Rod Serling.
Wow. I mean, all of them I understand. Now, is Rod, that's not the actor, right? Is he?
The director, the producer of The Twilight Zone.
Now, why him?
Because part of my interest in writing in that genre was from watching that series. Oh. And he died young, so most people my generation never got a chance to interact with him.
Right, right.
So I used to try to write in that sort of tone. I used to write short stories in that tone with the beginning, the middle, and then the twist. The beginning, the twist, and then the conclusion. I call them morality plays. So because he died when I was so young, I was like, oh, I would have loved to have written for him when I grew up. So interviewing him would have been a blast. Baldwin and Baker, the reasons speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, Baldwin's the best writer. Ever. I mean, I don't know about Shakespeare, but I mean, in terms of like the modern era, if you take into account theater, poetry, short story, novella, play, novel, and essay. Sentence is command with sentences. I just can't. I haven't the words.
I hear you.
Literally, he does.
Right.
The words.
Right. And those are three outstanding choices. And Bijan, I want to thank you for taking the time to interview on the show today. You have been inspiring, enlightening, and just the stories that you told just kind of gave us a broader perspective, especially with DC sports and championships and all that. Let me just ask you, is there a social media wise, is there anything that you want to give us for people to contact you, just in case they choose to?
Sure. The easiest is Twitter. It's at Bijan C. Bayne. So it's at, then the spelling of Bijan, middle initial C, and Bayne, B-A-Y. It's probably the easiest. And thanks for asking.
Absolutely. And I want to say, as I say to all my guests who come on the show, you have gone beyond the culture, and I thank you for being with me today.
I really thank you for having me on, and enjoy the rest of your holiday weekend.
Now, if you want to continue to hear inspiring interviews like the one you heard today, I want you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. Also, rate the show and please leave a comment. I would also love it if you would share this podcast with your friends to let them know that we're on. Finally, please go to our website at www.beyondtheculturepodcast.com, or you can email me at beyondtheculturepodcast@gmail.com. On the website, you can subscribe to the show and connect with me by leaving your email address. I'd love to hear from you. This is your host, Dr. David Walker, and we'll talk again on Beyond the Culture. Take care.